Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Michael Green. I'm joining you from a sunny, summery Sydney, Australia. And with me is a longtime friend and colleague from the snowy suburbs of Washington, D.C., Bonnie Glaser. Welcome, Bonnie.
Great to be back, Mike. Glad to see that you're still doing the Asia Chessboard podcast.
Yeah, it's been great. And having people on like you helps us really unpack some issues. And the one we're going to dive into today is Taiwan. There aren't many people in Washington who have tracked the cross-strait issue and the broader geopolitics than you. And so we're really going to get into it. But let's briefly sort of do what we often do on this podcast and start out with your story. I know you went to Csis, I think, but I'm sure when you were a teenager, you did not think you'd be doing exactly what you're doing now. So how did that happen?
My interest in Asia was piqued when I took a course in Asian history. It was an overview course that basically focused on Japan and China and India. I was a freshman at Oberlin College. And I transferred in my sophomore year to Boston University. I designed my major around China as a case study in modernization. And in the first day of my Chinese politics class, Mao Zedong died, marking the end of the Cultural Revolution. I was hooked. I was fascinated by what was going on in China, although, of course, there was very little reliable information available at the time. And then I spent 2 summers at Middlebury College in Vermont studying Chinese, supplemented that with courses at Tufts in language and literature. And then after I graduated from BU, I lived in Taiwan for a year and a half. Very interesting period, 1979, 1980. Did some traveling around the region. And then, as you said, I went to Csis and did international relations. And then I fell into the think tank world, and the rest is history.
I know that when I was working with Kurt Campbell in the Pentagon in the 90s, you were a very important source of insights because you did so many trips between or back and forth to Beijing and Taipei, and your insights into both were key. I'm guessing it's a lot harder to do that now with China.
Absolutely. I myself have not been back to China since 2019, though nobody has told me that I couldn't get a visa, but I personally just don't feel sufficiently safe. And I hope someday that I feel safe enough to go. But I think that the kinds of conversations that I, and of course many others, had in later years, because I started going to China as a professional, talking to people in think tanks very early in 1983. But the kind of conversations that people had in the 80s and particularly the 90s and maybe even early 2000s, things have gone, they've opened, they've closed, but now we are definitely in a period where people are extremely cautious. It's difficult to even meet one-on-one with individuals. And you can have better conversations, I think, with Chinese scholars outside of China.
That's what I find. I haven't been to Beijing since 2019 myself for the same reasons. It's there, but for the grace of God goes I, story of the 2 Michaels of Canada, whose profile isn't so different from you or me or a lot of people we know. So very hard to do. I also find the best conversations I have are, elsewhere in Asia anyway, but that's very limited to what used to be possible, especially for real China hands like you. So how do you try to track what's happening in Zhongnanhai and form your research without that same level of access to human beings who have insights themselves?
It is difficult. I certainly talk to Chinese who come through the US or meet elsewhere, Europe, other Asian countries, try to read a lot of Chinese language material and talk to a lot of other people. There are a few people who are going to China, I will not name them, who are having very good meetings because of various contacts that they have. I talk to people even from the Chinese embassy here, including on the military side. So it's not the same, but we all have to use whatever we can get access to. And even data these days is very difficult to get access to.
By design, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. But what makes it maybe a little easier is that hide and bide, the Deng Xiaoping era of obfuscation is ending, and Xi Jinping says what he's going to do. I mean, there's a lot more clarity, if you will, about his intent in statements, speeches, military operations. So that must add a little bit more even if it's troublesome or worrying, a little bit more clarity about intent? Do you find that?
Well, I think we'll talk about that specifically in regards to Taiwan, because I think people have read a little bit too much into Xi Jinping's rhetoric on Taiwan. For example, seeing 2027 as a deadline and a certain date by which Xi Jinping would use force against Taiwan. And I certainly don't see it that way.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So let's talk about Xi's intent towards Taiwan and get into that one. I've often looked at the sort of variation in how Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao or Xi have described their Taiwan policy as somewhere on the spectrum between, if you divorce me, I'll kill you, which would be the anti-secession law of 2005, and, Jiang's famous Taiwan white paper or Xi statements, which are a little more in the flavor of, if you don't marry me, I'll kill you, but without a real deadline. So where are you on that spectrum? What's the outcome you think Xi wants to achieve before he's gone from the scene? Not invasion by 2027, okay, but what does he want to achieve, do you think?
I think that Xi Jinping certainly wants to make some progress toward what they use the term, of course, reunification. I prefer the term unification because Taiwan was really, of course, never part of the People's Republic of China. And people argue that in some ways it may not have been part of China, but we'll leave the history aside. I think that Xi Jinping would like to have at least political talks with a government in Taiwan. That would probably require a KMT president unless all preconditions are dropped. Right now, the preconditions really are on Beijing's side, where they insist that the president of Taiwan accept that Taiwan is part of China, or something like the 1992 consensus, in which they disagree what to call the country, but they both agreed when Ma Ying-jeou was president that Taiwan and the mainland were both nevertheless part of the same country. Of course, Xi Jinping, I think, would like to achieve a reintegration of the two sides, if that were possible at an acceptable cost. But I think he has come to understand that the costs are likely very, very high. I think Xi Jinping paid a lot of attention to the Ukraine war. He understands the costs that he would pay. Rolling tanks into Ukraine turned out to not solve the problem for Russia very quickly, and the Chinese would have to cross almost 100 miles of water. And then in addition to that, we all know that China is facing enormous economic problems, and at the same time, Xi Jinping is dealing with lots of corruption cases in the PLA, and he appears to be very dissatisfied with the progress that the PLA has made. I think he doesn't have confidence that the PLA could actually succeed in taking Taiwan. So what he may have wanted to achieve when he first came to power regarding Taiwan, now more than 11 years ago, I think he realizes he probably cannot achieve, even if he remains in power for another 5 to 10 years. And maybe he'll remain in power for, until the day he drops. But we just don't know.
I want to come back to the military strategy, because for a leader who's moved away from the idea that he can perhaps achieve unification in his lifetime, there's an awful lot of military operations going on around Taiwan. We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's focus on the first part of what you said, which is the political piece. It's not unusual, as you know well, in geopolitics to have two sides in intractable positions. Look at the Middle East, look at Ukraine and Russia, and so on and so on. But the 92 consensus, let alone a predicate for negotiations that Taiwan is part of China, I mean, that's an absolute non-starter for Lai Ching-te and the current government. But can you even imagine a future KMT government agreeing to that? I mean, I think what happened under Ma Ying-jeou could be extremely difficult in the wake of the Hong Kong crackdown, the enormous pressure being placed on Taiwan right now. Do you think what Xi is aiming for, returning to what was achieved under Ma Ying-jeou, is it all realistic? It seems to me the Taiwan people have moved on.
Yeah, I agree with that to a certain extent. The KMT itself is very fractured. It would depend on who the leader was. Nobody is likely to come to power from the KMT that shares the same worldview that Ma Ying-jeou had, which I think was really very unique. And the kind of person who would come to power today would be younger. The youth in Taiwan certainly have long rejected one country, two systems and 1992 consensus. As you say, is, I think, pretty much dead. And there's very little confidence that the PRC would respect any existing system of government in Taiwan after having witnessed what took place in Hong Kong. So I certainly agree with you on that. But right now, I think that the Chinese have lowered the bar a little bit for just the time being. The Chinese, from what I hear, are saying what they want Taiwan to say is that they're all one family, that the people who live in Taiwan are Chinese, even if they're also Taiwanese, and that would be good enough for in other words, to stabilize the relationship for the time being. But I don't think that that's enough for Xi Jinping as a legacy issue, if in fact achieving more with Taiwan is a legacy.
Bonnie, you say you're in the minority on this one, so obviously a lot of people in Washington are worried about Xi's rhetoric combined with the higher operational tempo of the PLA around Taiwan, other activities like cyber and cable cutting we'll talk about. Is, maybe the majority view has been ramped up because of Ukraine and people realize we underestimated Putin's intent. But explain to me a little more why you think that people are reading too much into Xi's rhetoric. It's different from Hu and Zhang in many ways, but are you seeing it and thinking actually not so much?
So I would really emphasize the continuity in rhetoric. And what has really changed is, of course, the military capabilities. And that's important and we should not ignore it. But there are people who believe that Xi Jinping has set out statements that are fundamentally new, which I think, in fact, are not. So, for example, Xi Jinping said at the 19th Party Congress that reunification is essential for national rejuvenation. But that really has a long lineage. Jiang Zemin loosely linked reunification with national rejuvenation at the 15th Party Congress in 1997. He said at the time the complete reunification of the motherland and the comprehensive revitalization of the nation will certainly be achieved. And then Hu Jintao said something at the 17th Party Congress, that was in 2007, he said cross-strait reunification is a historical necessity for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And even the idea of setting a target, which Xi Jinping has set for 2049, the middle of the century for reunification, even the idea of that kind of a timeline was referred to, or at least alluded to, by Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. They both talked about building China into a rich, strong, democratic, and civilized socialist country by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, which, of course, is 2049. So this has sort of been a target date for some time. There's also people who refer to Xi Jinping talking about how differences between Taiwan and mainland China should not be passed down from one generation to the next. And that has been, I think, seen by some people as really alarming. But once again, that's something that prior leaders have also referred to previously. And the context in which he said it, which was 2014, talking to Taiwan's the former vice president, Vincent Xiao, I think was on the margins of APEC. The relationship between Taiwan and China was very good at that time. And I think Xi Jinping was saying, we really ought to move this to the next level. And let's remember that when Ma Ying-jeou was when he first became president in Taiwan, he actually endorsed the idea of political talks. So Xi Jinping was basically saying, yeah, let's move this to the next level. So I'm less concerned about the rhetoric. I am concerned about the military capabilities. So, the intent is, as I said, Xi Jinping wants to make some progress on Taiwan, but I think he would be satisfied with less than unification, depending on what the cost would be. And I think it's important to also make the point that I don't think Xi Jinping has abandoned achieving unification through all sorts of gray zone pressure rather than actual kinetic force.
Right. So let's turn then to the pressure on Taiwan. We'll come back to, you gave us a great distillation of how to think about Xi Jinping's ends, his objectives, his intent. We should do that for Lijiangdo and Taipei. But first, let's go to the military and other coercive measures on Taiwan. There's a lot. In many ways, there's been a cyber war underway for years, including interference, social media, and all the rest. The story recently about the cable cutting, the increased PLA operational tempo crossing the line between the two that was always maintained for tactical air, and now regular circumnavigation of the island, combined arms exercises, all the rest. It's an unmistakable uptick. Uptick doesn't even do it justice in the military pressure on Taiwan. Why? Is this to break the will of the people of Taiwan steadily? Is it to deter independence? All of the above? What are they after with this? If it's not unification by 2027, what's it all for?
The gray zone pressure on Taiwan, I think, has been part of China's playbook for a long time. It's just that, again, their capabilities have expanded tremendously. And cyber attacks, for example, are not new. Even military operations, of course, Taiwan are not new, but they've just expanded exponentially. I think that Chinese hope to instill a sense of lack of confidence among the Taiwanese people in their government and in the United States, and ultimately convince them that they would have a better life, a better future if they became part of the PRC in one way or in one form or another. And so I think that this is really very much part of China's strategy. It's to achieve unification by eroding the confidence of people in their own government, their ability to remain autonomous, to prosper, and particularly in the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan. And if China can effectively undermine the credibility of American support and security assistance while simultaneously demonstrating to the people of Taiwan that their government lacks the will or the capability to respond to Chinese pressure, then an invasion won't be needed. So ultimately, this is the strategy for unification. And achieving unification by force is, I think, it's plan B. It's certainly not the preference that Xi Jinping has.
And force, of course, is plan A for the anti-independence strategy. If Beijing gets to a point where they believe that Taiwan's moving towards de jure independence or something like that, then these military forces actually would have a more active role, I assume, based on that.
Well, I like to distinguish between a war of necessity and a war of choice. If Taiwan declares independence, the United States supports that independence and recognizes Taiwan as an independent sovereign state, then I think that Xi Jinping has to act, because failing to do so would weaken his position and potentially the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So that becomes a war of necessity.
The danger in that, though, is, and I know this from my time in government and from dialogue with Beijing, as you would as well, that their interpretation of what constitutes de jure independence is the bar is a lot lower. There's a lot less tolerance. And so there is a real danger that Washington and Beijing interpret Taipei's actions very differently. So when you say war of necessity, it wouldn't be a war of necessity under international law. It'd be a war of necessity, I assume, because of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And their metric for that could be quite different from what the U.S. or the international community, let alone Taiwan, considers, an actual move to independence. So there's a lot of danger in that gap, I would think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, of course, it's a war of its political necessity.
Right. You're not saying a legitimate war.
Right. It is not necessarily legitimate. But I do think we have a pretty good understanding as to what Xi Jinping's real red lines are. Not certainty, but, U.S. selling arms to Taiwan is clearly not a real red line, right? But if the United States were to, as I said, actually recognize Taiwan or revive the Mutual Defense Treaty, I do think that would cross a red line.
Would the next administration declaring that strategic ambiguity is over and making a security guarantee even if it's not ratified by the Senate as a treaty. Would that be a red line or a sort of dotted red line? Or how would you view that?
Well, President Biden himself said 4 times that he would come to Taiwan's defense if it were attacked. And that obviously wasn't a red line. But of course, there's a broader context to what he said. Though I think that actually Trump is likely to do just the opposite. And he has already signaled in several interviews that he believes that preserving ambiguity provides him with leverage, and he doesn't want to give up that leverage. So I think there's less likelihood under the Trump administration that there would be a move to a strategic clarity than there was under the Biden administration.
Interesting. So coming back to the kind of the end game, I guess, for Xi's strategy as you see it, which is breaking the will of the people of Taiwan. It's sort of demonstrating that resistance is futile. That requires the military pressure. It requires discrediting the US or Japan or others' support for Taiwan. What other elements would be in there? Do you think there has to be or would be an elite capture dimension that they get a fellow traveler elected in Taipei or other internal sort of classic Mao insurgency tools? What else would go into this endgame if it's a non-kinetic, not, avoiding war with the United States, but using military and other pressure to break the will of the people at Taiwan? There's more than the military, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's still a lot of debate going on in China as to whether or not they would give Taiwan a better, sort of option than Hong Kong. But over time, it would end up that if it didn't start that way, that Taiwan would in my view, just be sort of another province in China. I don't think that they would tolerate having a leader in Taiwan who really wanted to have great autonomy. They certainly don't want Taiwan to have its own military. That would be dangerous. So arms sales would be over. They wouldn't let them buy arms. And the foreign policy would have to be captured within Taiwan being part of China. So at the United Nations, for example, the Chinese have already said in some conversations that, maybe Taiwan could have a seat, in that would be combined under China. So yeah, all of these things, I don't think they've really been thought through very well, but there could be circumstances if there were a leader in Taiwan that agreed to political talks with Beijing, and then that would definitely trigger greater discussion in China as to what their bottom lines were, what their demands were. But this just seems so hypothetical to me, Mike, because I don't see this happening anytime soon.
Yeah. I mean, it's not impossible. It worries me, to be honest. It's one step to having a leader like that emerge in Taiwan who agrees to political talks and say, for example, in order to have those proceed smoothly, stops arms sales from the US and then takes other steps vis-a-vis Japan and agrees to economic structures with China that create more dependency. You could imagine a not completely outlandish scenario where there's a compliant leader in Taipei who does what seem like stabilization and peace talks, but what in fact do is remove Taiwan's deterrence and connections with the US, Japan, and others in ways that make them even more vulnerable for the next round of coercion. So it becomes a dangerous, slippery slope. But I agree with you, it's not likely. You have hit on something I think a lot of people miss in this whole debate, and frankly miss it in Asia, in Australia, less so Japan, but in Australia, Korea, Southeast Asia, and even perhaps Europe, you'd know better. But a lot of people miss this key point, which is the center of gravity in this whole contest is the will of the people on Taiwan. And as you know, when the Biden administration sent a group of former officials, including me, after Ukraine, the whole point was to have a high-profile demonstration of the people of Taiwan that the U.S. had their back, and that the lesson from Ukraine should be that the world comes together to defend democracies. The propaganda line and social media interference from China was saying the opposite. Look, the Americans didn't send boots on the ground in Ukraine. If anything happens to Taiwan, you're alone, you're doomed. And so I think the Biden administration understood that center of gravity issue. It's important that Australia, Europe, others do as well, because they have agency. They can demonstrate support for the people of Taiwan, in ways that are not necessarily dangerous or provocative. But you focus on that. A lot of people kind of forget that key part of this whole puzzle.
Well, I think that a lot of people don't appreciate how successful China, some parts of China's strategy have been toward Taiwan, and particularly sowing doubts about the United States. So just to cite an example, there was one poll in Taiwan that in 2020 showed that 60% of respondents believe that the United States would send troops to defend Taiwan if China invaded. And in 2022, before Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan, that poll showed that only 36% believed that the United States would send troops. So there's this discussion in Taiwan, which is referred to as the America skepticism, the Ime Lun. And I think that this is really sort of taken hold in part due to China's propaganda, its narratives, its disinformation, because obviously the United States continues to be very supportive of Taiwan in all sorts of ways, even though we don't have a defense treaty commitment like we have, with Japan or Australia or South Korea, or like we used to have with Taiwan because we had a mutual defense treaty until 1979. But I worry about this corroding the support, the belief in Taiwan that the United States just would not come to Taiwan's support.
You mentioned the polling showed a decline in trust in the U.S. up to Speaker Pelosi's visit. Is there polling since? Did it rebound after she went?
I have not seen. I'd have to go back and look and see if that particular poll has been conducted since then. But I know there was another poll asked a different question about overall trust in the United States. And in 2021, that was 45%. And in 2023, obviously after Pelosi's visit, it was 34%. So I do think this trend is worrisome.
In Japan and Australia and Korea, you see some similar trends that began back in the Obama administration, actually, where there's a secular decline in trust in the U.S., but a completely diametrically opposed upward trend in support for the alliance. So that in Japan and Korea, over 90% in most polls support the alliance. So it's almost like the Americans are worrying, but they're the only Americans we have. And I wonder if that's also evident in Taiwan, that as much as they're worried about what the U.S. might do and whether the U.S. has the staying power, the severity of what they're facing with China also clarifies that they've got no better choice. Do you see any of that? Because that's what you see in other allies in Asia.
Yeah, that's absolutely true in spades for Taiwan. Of course, there is no country in the world that sells weapons to Taiwan other than the United States, although we may be seeing some movement there, and some countries in Europe, for example, are supplying components to systems that, in the past they were more reluctant to do. But Taiwan has a very special relationship with the United States. If there were to be a Chinese invasion, they don't expect that any country would come to help them other than the U.S. and maybe Japan, and we could talk about that. But they believe Japan is, I think people who are informed in the government believe that Japan would only really work alongside the United States. Though it's fascinating, there was one poll last year in Taiwan that showed that the sort of general public believed Japan was more likely to come to rescue Taiwan than the United States, even if the United States was not in the war.
Yes, I saw that. It was quite striking. It tells you a lot about the very warm feelings that the Japanese and people in Taiwan have towards each other, and a little bit about the security policy literacy of the people in Taiwan, to be honest. So let's talk about Washington. I mean, you and I have been doing this since the Ming Dynasty, something like that. And I've never seen such bipartisan support for Taiwan in Washington. And the public opinion polls as well are pretty strong in historical comparison. But I've been away for a couple of years. How do you see the view in DC about this? Is the U.S. reliable? I certainly seem to see in Congress more, not less, support for Taiwan over time.
I think that there is definitely bipartisan support in Congress for Taiwan. It's at an all-time high, but there's differences about whether what the United States does to support Ukraine, how that would affect Taiwan. So you probably know the leadership in Taiwan thinks there's a very close linkage, very concerned that the United States might stop providing weapons to Ukraine, and that would lead people in Taiwan to have even less confidence in the United States. And I think there are members of Congress who just think we should stop supporting Ukraine. Even the incoming vice president, who I think has been quite influenced by Bridge Colby, by the way, because Bridge has argued that we should be focused like a laser on deterring China. We should preserve all of our capabilities and focus all of our attention on preventing a war in the Taiwan Strait. And we should stop supporting Ukraine. We should leave this for Europe to worry about. So there are differences in terms of how I think members of Congress think about that. But a lot of support for supplying weapons. There's now foreign military financing and presidential drawdown authority that is providing weapons to Taiwan, as well as the traditional just way that we have had foreign military sales. So, and I think the average public in the United States, I don't have any poll numbers off the top of my head, but there's been a bit of an uptick in people's awareness of Taiwan and willingness to support Taiwan. That said, we've got a president coming in that clearly doesn't want to get entangled in a war anywhere. That will probably lead to a lot more pressure on Taiwan to increase defense spending, to do more to conduct training in a way that is really realistic, certainly to not be provocative, behave in a way that might cause Xi Jinping to invade. And there might be more pressure on companies like TSMC to invest more in the United States.
I think this whole, Asia first theoretical argument that we should disengage from Ukraine and use all those resources on Asia is not going to last. It just doesn't. It's so two-dimensional. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The new administration is going to hear loud and clear from Taiwan, from Australia, Japan, and from Korea that that's not how they see it. They're in the front lines in Asia, and they worry a lot about the signals that the conflict in Ukraine would send to Beijing. And if you study history, the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor, when you read the accounts of the debates in Tokyo, was very heavily shaped by what was happening in the war in Europe, and so on and so forth. So I think it all sounds very theoretically interesting, but it's not going to hold up under scrutiny. And, people in government are going to be hearing a lot from the intelligence community, from their allies. Pretty confident about that, but we'll see. It's funny, if we were doing this podcast 20 years ago, we would have spent 80% of it asking, what does Chen Shui-bian want? Because he was the wild card. He was the independent variable. He was the thing that made war and peace seem in the balance, right? You heard almost none of that with Tsai Ing-wen. What's your take on Lai Ching-te? We asked what Xi Jinping wants. What does Lai Ching-te want? You and I both met him. He's clearly coming from a place within the green camp that would probably, in a perfect world, love to have independence, but he's also proven to be, if not quite as pragmatic as Tsai Ing-wen, pretty pragmatic. But what's your take?
Well, Lai Ching-te comes from a very different background, of course, than Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai joined the DPP quite late. Lai has been a member of the New Tide faction in the DPP, very pro-independence. He did say, which is kind of widely quoted when he became the premier, and I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2017 when he went to Taipei and he became the premier, and he was doing interpellation in front of the Legislative Yuan and was asked about a position that he had taken regarding the United States and Taiwan and Japan, because he had said some things when he was in Washington, D.C. about the relationships. And he I think, was basically trying to tell the legislator who asked him the question, you really need to understand that I'm a very, very strong supporter of independence. And he said, I am a political worker for Taiwan independence. Later on, that was changed to say I'm a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. But I think he was speaking very honestly, and that is who he is. But I think he has come to understand the risks of actually pushing for de jure independence. I do not think that he is quite as pragmatic as Tsai Ing-wen. He has come in to power with some ambitions. One, I think, is to reinterpret what the Constitution means. That's the Republic of China Constitution, which you've, I'm sure, read it, but maybe not all of your listeners had, but it defines the ROC territory as including not only mainland China, but also Mongolia. And I think that the United States would like to not see Taiwan redefine what the Republic of China encompasses. But Lai has talked about in his speeches the Republic of China as referring to the outlying islands, Jinmen, Mazu, the island of Penghu, and then, of course, the main island of Taiwan. And he has not included mainland China. And he has said some other things in his speeches that referred to, for example, in his inaugural speech, he referred to Tainan and the Dutch landing in Taiwan, and essentially was saying that Taiwan's history really started about 400 years ago. And that, of course, would be a very different account of history than you would hear from somebody in China, or really necessarily hear from people who are, other people who are in the DPP. Tsai Ing-wen never explicitly talked about Taiwan in those terms. So I think I would say he's less careful. He is more certain that Taiwan is, in fact, an independent sovereign state and must remain so. He has not closed the door on dialogue with Beijing, but again, I don't think that the likelihood is very high that there would be dialogue.
In my interactions with him, I detected a politician who has this in his DNA, as you say, but had learned the lessons of Chen Shui-bian, who took those same instincts and turned them into policy in ways that were very risky for Taiwan and for the region. And so I take some comfort in that, and I think that will regulate, that will moderate what he does. When I was in the NSC, I lived through some very difficult political leaders in Asia who really, in different ways, challenged the traditional relationship with the U.S. Chen Shui-bian was one, but Roh Moo-hyun in Korea, Mark Latham, who was the opposition leader in Australia, all those political parties, the Labour Party in Australia, the DPP in Japan with Hatoyama, the Minjidang in Korea, and the DPP in Taiwan, all of them have learned the lesson when one of their leaders messed up the relationship with the U.S. So my sense from Lai Ching-te is if Washington and other close friends like Tokyo are very clear with him, he will listen. And he will look for what he can do to express his feelings about independence, but it will take some very, in my view, active diplomacy, and not just by the U.S. It's going to require Japan, Australia, and a lot of others to send the signals of what's tolerable.
I really agree with that, because I think for Lai, he recognizes the importance of increasing international support for Taiwan and the role that it has played in the last few years, and wants to continue to grow that support. I think he recognizes that if he were to do something that countries like Japan, Australia, countries in Europe, not to mention the United States, would see as provocative, that would cause other countries to be more distant from Taiwan and more cautious, and that could open up new opportunities for Xi Jinping. And so I think you're right that international support is a really important factor in Lai Ching-te's calculus.
And I have had the view for some time that one of the very important international players in this is Europe and NATO and the EU. And of course, you were working on this pretty intensely when you were at CSIS, and now, obviously at German Marshall Fund. My impression was that Beijing, certainly talking to experts and even government officials, had some confidence that in a Taiwan contingency, they could divide and neutralize Europe. I would hope after Ukraine and other things that they don't have that confidence. And if, such a significant geopolitical presence and trading partner for China is not on side or can't be neutralized, that helps with deterrence. But what's your take, because you spent a lot of time on it, on the transatlantic piece of this puzzle, which I think is very important and often underlooked?
Well, Taiwan was barely part of the transatlantic conversation, I think, until probably maybe late Trump administration, but definitely early Biden administration. The late Trump administration established Indo-Pacific consultations. And I think they focus mostly on China. And then the Biden administration established a separate, they continued the Indo-Pacific consultations, but they also had a separate mechanism to talk about China and Taiwan. And a lot of time has been spent over the last 4 years in transatlantic meetings at various levels talking about Taiwan. And I think there's been a lot of realization in Europe that Taiwan may be geographically far away, but that a catastrophe, any kind of military conflict, or even quarantine where there's interference with shipping in the Taiwan Strait would be devastating, and far more so than the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the shutdown of the Nord Stream pipeline. And when there was actually research and data that came out on this, and Rhodium Group was the first to look at a very low-end contingency in which there was no kinetic force used, but a long-term blockade around Taiwan, and found that there would just be billions of dollars that would be affected. And then Bloomberg has done similar studies looking at other contingencies, and even said in the worst case, there could be a 10% reduction in global GDP. So Europe has woken up to the importance of Taiwan, and not only in terms of economics and trade, but also technology. And so what we've started to see is some like German ships for the first time actually transiting the Taiwan Strait. And we have seen more quiet conversations about what kind of sanctions could be imposed on China. And my understanding is that that has even been communicated to Xi Jinping, that there would be, by, of course, senior European leaders, that if force were to be used against Taiwan, that there would be severe consequences, including sanctions on China. Now, of course, it matters what those are. There are some lessons we can draw from Ukraine, but it would be somewhat different. China has taken many steps to insulate itself from some of the kinds of sanctions that we've used against Russia. But I think one of the most important things is the market, because the European market is extremely important to China. So being willing to limit market access, to restrict exports of critical items in addition to maybe financial sanctions, those are the kinds of things that I think are being discussed. I don't know how detailed they are, whether there is a real plan in place, but the fact that those discussions are underway is very important.
I know, and there are people who will be going into this new administration who understand all of this, but the rhetoric right now coming out of the Trump team on Europe is not going to help. So we'll see. You're in the hot seat, Bonnie, at the German Marshall Fund. I hope you're telling our friends in Europe to take a breath and wait till the administration's in place and focus on their interests. But it's not the right kind of environment for trust right now in the transatlantic dialogue that's emerging with the transition. But we'll see. We'll see. There are, as you and I know, some pretty serious people coming in the administration who realize that a key part of deterrence on the Taiwan problem is going to run through Europe. So we'll stay tuned and watch your work, which is terrific. Bonnie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
And thanks always to Michael Nock, our producer.